Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Pereira. India, US, Japan and Australia gave a thumbs up for a free, open, prosperous and inclusive Indo-Pacific region after the first officials meeting on the Indo-Pacific on the sidelines of the ASEAN summit in Manila on Sunday, resurrecting the Quadrilateral from the ashes. The officials exchanged views on addressing common challenges of terrorism and proliferation linkages impacting the region, as well as on enhancing connectivity. Trump has openly renamed the Asia-Pacific to become the new Indo-Pacific, a sign that the US would put India front and center in its Asia strategy. Of the big picture, we will analyze the strategic importance of the Quadrilateral. Joining me on the program today are Sushant, Sareen, Strategic Affairs Analyst and Senior Fellow, Vivekananda International Foundation. Bharat, Karnad, Research Professor, National Security Studies, Center for Policy Research. Dhruva, Jaishankar, Fellow, Foreign Policy, Brookings, India. And Commodore C. Uday, Bhaskar, Director, Society for Policy Studies. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Commodore, I'd like to begin with you. Just a couple of weeks ago, we were speaking about this when Japan made this proposal and, everyone seemed to be upbeat. Now it seems to have been put in motion and the wheels seem to be turning quite fast.
Well, I think this idea of the Quadrilateral, which had been mooted, as you pointed out, as far back as August 2007, is being revisited. And I would say that the Tillerson speech, Secretary of State Mr. Tillerson, when he spoke in Washington, D.C., and spoke about the Indo-Pacific and the fact that India and the United States would now be seen as the two bookends of stability in the region, is something that has been clearly given political traction. And the fact that US President Mr. Donald Trump has repeatedly used the word Indo-Pacific, despite the fact that the Chinese were not enthused, is, to my mind, another signal. And very swiftly, if you look at the sequence of events, Mr. Tillerson speaks on the 18th of October. That's the day when President Xi Jinping is inaugurating the Chinese Party Congress and he's being elevated on par with Mao, etc. And very swiftly, Japan is off the blocks. And the Japanese foreign minister talks about recalling the Abe vision, the confluence of the oceans, and the need perhaps to have democracies, and that's the really subtext, working together. So from there to the East Asia Summit, and very quickly the fact that the four countries decided to have an officials meeting, the signal that one can perhaps infer is that between the United States, India, Japan and now Australia, they are now putting it back into a political kind of priority issue. Where they will go remains to be seen, meaning that while the officials are meeting, at the end of the day, how will the Quadrilateral function and what would be its operational profile, if there is one? At the moment, what we are doing are exercises. India, Japan, Malabar, India, Japan, USA, sometimes with Australia. But there's a difference between doing exercises and moving to some kind of an operational objective. I would say that's a work in progress. But the Quad is there.
Yeah, the Quad is there.
Yeah.
And Sushant, Sareen, what is the strategic importance of the Quad?
I think the strategic importance is pretty clear. All the countries of the Quad and in fact of other countries on the Chinese rim have major interests in China and yet have major concerns about China. On their own, they all apprehensive of China's bullying, China's aggressiveness, China's assertiveness, and even the US, for example, cannot take on China all alone. So I think there is this sense that it is important for these countries to tie up, try and have some kind of commonality in terms of their security policies, in how they view the developing situation, and of course the trick is going to be how, as Commodore Bharat says, how do you operationalize it? As of now, I think it's very baby steps which have been taken so far, nothing more than that. While there is a certain desire to see the Quad take off, but in what direction? If you look at India's initial statement which came out when the Japanese proposal came in, it was a very cautious thing. Absolutely correct that India will see and engage with these countries to the extent that it serves its own interests, which is precisely what the other countries are going to do. The question is going to be, to my mind, will their interests converge And what will be the point of convergence? Will it be solely aimed against China, or is it something more than that? There is also this issue that, how do they balance their interests of remaining very deeply engaged with China? For example, India's trade, or Australia or Japan or the US, when Trump goes out there, he strikes some really fancy trade deals, and yet, he starts talking about the Quad. Now, that is what normally happens in diplomacy. But the question is, how do we move from just talking about this to the next level? And from an Indian point of view, is India really now ready to enter into the diplomacy of alliances, something which we have more or less shunned since independence?
Right.
And to my mind, that will be the brave new world for India to enter. On our own, we could probably keep many of these countries at bay, or countries which have an adversarial relationship with us at bay, but can we really take them on? And to my mind, that is the big question.
Sure.
So I don't see any problem in taking that next big step for Indian diplomacy, and even entering into some kind of an alliance arrangement, because that is what serves our interests at this point in time, and for the foreseeable future.
Let me bring in Bharat Karnad into the picture. As far as the agenda is concerned, what do you think the agenda for all the countries involved should be going forward?
Well, basically, I think the agenda has to be practical. When you talk about alliances and so on, that suggests almost a complete comprehensive overlap of interests, which is not the case and will never happen. Certainly not with the United States. You're on opposite sides of the earth, literally, and therefore to think that their interests in any way completely coincide with India's would be to presume too much. The fact of the matter is that, assuming there is some kind of a partnership, it will have to be on the basis of very narrow aims that everybody agrees with. So the most obvious concern for everybody, that's a common denominator actually, is China. Now, as has been said, and this is a truism, that just about all the parties in the Quad and in Asia are interlinked economically with China. But how do you balance the economic trade-offs with the security concerns? You see, I mean, the benefits you get from, say, Chinese investment in smaller states, to saying, well, it poses a threat to the state itself. That may not be the case for India. We are far too big. But it nevertheless, I think, in some sense, very starkly frames the issues and, in a sense, focuses it on purely the military aspects. Now, that might mean, in practical sense, interoperability and so on and so forth, and ways to manage security. And in a concerted way, I think, go forward in terms of contesting the very strategic spaces that the Chinese have claimed as their own, like in South China Sea. They have their identification zone that they have imposed. They say it's the exclusive economic zone, so the economic interests, despite the Hague Tribunal last July saying that, well, there's no such thing and it's completely ultra virus of the laws and so on, International Convention of the Seas. So it's all illegal, the synthetic islands they've created in the South China Sea and so on. So that is the sort of immediate concerns and ways to deal with it. For instance, then the question is, a FONOPS, would that be a purely American kind of a thing where the American warships come and go, keeping in mind the 12-mile limit, etc., territorial sea, that the Hague Tribunal, by way of, reacting to the fait accompli of China by creating these islands, respecting those kinds of things, to have these patrols, constantly, so as to challenge and keep challenging the Chinese notion that that's their exclusive space. Now, what will India do? Will it send flotillas out there? I always said that I think our stance has to be far more forward than it's been. Ours is a recessive, defensive, passive kind of a mindset. We haven't gotten out of it still. And therefore, it would be good, very good for India, for instance, to have a forward presence on Nha Trang,
right,
on the Vietnamese coast.
Yeah.
That's the sort of thing I think we should think of,
Sure.
rather than get on to the American coattails or something, or rely on the Japanese, depending on what it is they do.
Right.
We have to chart out our own course.
Sure. Dhruva, Jaishankar, who stands to gain the most from this kind of an alliance?
Look, I mean, I think there are a few misconceptions here. I think one, it would be unfair to characterize this as any kind of alliance or budding alliance. I mean, I would actually agree with Bharat Karnad on this. I think that connotes a kind of relationship between these four partners that, I mean, the US and Japan, Japan and Australia are US allies. India is not, and I don't think will become one. That being said, India does take part in a lot of consultations, multilateral consultations with Russia and China as part of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, already with Japan and the US, with Japan and Australia separately. And so this is just one more as part of that constellation. And obviously it's something that makes China uncomfortable, the idea that these four countries coming together. There is sort of a commonality of interest here, and there's no reason why they shouldn't be talking to each other. In terms of what this actually looks like going forward, I mean, all four of these countries will be acting on their own self-interests, and I think India has very serious concerns about Chinese encroachment into the Indian Ocean. And this in and of itself is going to be a major task going forward, which is securing the Indian Ocean. To the extent that there can be a division of labor in that, I think that is good, and that serves Indian interests as much as it does anybody else's. In terms of what the agenda will look like, I think we have just seen baby steps, as was mentioned by Sushant Sareen. This was just a meeting of joint secretaries. It was not even a political level, let alone a political level meeting. So we'll have to see where this goes forward. But obviously some things are happening already, and I think we'll see a continuation along these lines. Cooperation in anti-submarine warfare, for example, is one area that we have seen some concrete cooperation take place. Maritime domain awareness, which is basically just tracking what is happening in the oceans. This is another major area. Just recently, just last week, 2 weeks ago, we saw an Indian vessel being refueled by the United States Navy in the Sea of Japan. And so this is exactly the kind of forward presence that we're starting to see happen. Now, so operationalizing this is taking place. What exactly this looks like in terms of what level of consultations take place between the four countries, what kind of exercises take place, how regular, at what level, is it maritime only, does it go into other domains, that remains to be seen. And finally, what kind of capacity building, what will be the division of labor? I think that also remains to be seen.
Sure. Commodore Bharat Karnad mentioned that China is the common denominator. Do you believe that this grouping is going to be inclusive in nature or otherwise?
Well, at the moment, I would say they are inclusive to the extent that they have a shared concern, which is the way in which China is trying to outline its own equivalent of conduct at sea, and the fact that they have rejected the current international law as derived from the UNCLOS and customary practice. In short, China is trying to sort of do things its way, and actually it's got away with it, because if you look at the whole South China Sea and the dispute with the ASEAN countries, already Philippines, which had taken the case to the UN tribunal for political reasons because of a domestic change in terms of the leadership, is now more empathetic to the Chinese position, so much so that at the current East Asia summit, the Philippines president had actually gone on record to say that don't touch this issue. He's supposed to have told Mr. Donald Trump that leave this and we will try and resolve it in our own way. There is a split in ASEAN already. So I think the four Quad countries at this point have a shared concern about the way in which China is adopting what you might call as a revisionist agenda. So they have all stated, if you look at the joint statement, not the joint, the individual statements that have come out after the Quad meeting, by and large, they're all focusing on the same aspect, which is the freedom of navigation, FON, respect for international law, an inclusive kind of approach, and, by and large, this is the same kind of common, I would say, objective. Where the rubber meets the road would be the degree to which now they are willing to actually deploy forces or actually resist China. In the event push comes to shove. We did not see that when the tribunal award was rejected by China. The Americans, for their own reason, decided that they would not really come to the aid of any of the ASEAN countries. But in a very subtle way, they said that we will exercise the right of freedom of navigation as far as our units are concerned. But they did not push it beyond a point. It was not a point of contention between President Trump and President Xi Jinping when they met in Beijing just a couple of days ago. So my sense is that after the officials meeting, they'll go back to their respective countries and really try and take stock about what next. Now, diplomatically, they have conveyed to China that good order at sea, as per the current status quo, which is derived from UNCLOS, and it's been in practice for more than 3-4 decades. It's a US-led order for which China also benefits.
Yes,
should be allowed to prevail. If China is going to now actually take a revisionist kind of posture from the South China Sea, it's now moving into the Indian Ocean.
Yes.
How will it conduct itself there? Will it be part of the status quo, or would it try and inject some kind of a new formulation? That is what I think would be very critical for India in particular.
Sure.
So at the moment, it's a wait and watch. They have identified a broad objective. But I think a convergence, I saw that word being used a couple of times in the statements. I don't think that's a valid proposition just now.
Okay.
I don't think there's a convergence in that sense. They're all concerned about good order at sea.
Sure. Sushant, Sareen, can we expect some kind of a reaction from Beijing looking at all these developments?
Obviously, you will. I think it's a no-brainer. I don't think the Chinese, given the kind of assertiveness they've been showing and the kind of build-up they've done of the Chinese leadership, I don't think they can afford to be seen backing down in any way. And this is where the problems are likely to come in. So, for example, when Commodore Bhaskar mentions about the Chinese entry into the Indian Ocean and whether they will, stay with the status quo, my point is that Chinese entry, and they've already entered the Indian Ocean, has altered the status quo. Where the next, where that equilibrium will be, achieved, we don't know yet, because we are all in a flux. It's going to enter into a state of flux, the strategic scenario around the Indian Ocean. Similarly, as far as the South China Sea is concerned, we might all issue very nice statements and very pious sentiments might be expressed, but the point is, will they deter China? And if the Chinese response is going to be to continue doing what they're already doing, and perhaps even browbeat some of the smaller countries, then what is it that the Quad countries are going to do? And this is where the problem starts coming in, because when you start talking about the split in ASEAN, which is very visible, one of the reasons for the split in ASEAN was that the kind of leadership role which the Americans used to display in this region in the past, they have actually been receding. They want to continue to remain the leader, but without playing the kind of leadership role. In a sense, they have ceded space to the Chinese, or the Chinese have grabbed it, whichever way you want to look at it. The other problem is that each of these countries, let's take some of the more prominent ones, whether it's a Vietnam or a Malaysia. You look at these countries, if they have to be pitted against or pit themselves against the Chinese, they are going to take the diplomatic route out. They're going to eat a bit of humble pie and back off for very simple reasons, that economically, militarily, and otherwise, they simply will not be able to face up to the Chinese.
Right.
And if they do, then there is a very heavy cost to be paid. On the other hand, if the Chinese are going to drop dollops of cash onto these countries, then, for any political leader, the initial thing is nobody is looking at what happens 20 years from now. How do you pay back all that money? The initial thing is that, look, at least for the next 10-15 years, I'll have a party while in power. So those are some of the problems which are likely to come in. So my point is that if this Quad has to, if it is just a talking shop, if it's just about consultations and, trying to, make the different positions of these 4 countries, trying to get some kind of a convergence on those positions, but nothing more than that, then I don't see how it's going to impress the Chinese very much. The fact that the Chinese are spooked by this, just the mere act of consultation, is quite heartening for me.
Sure,
but
okay.
If this is where this whole thing stops, then we have a problem on our hands, because then the Chinese will feel that they can continue to push their weight around. And that is something which is, the original purpose of this consultation was to prevent something like that from happening. So, in short, either the Quad moves on from these baby steps and starts taking some more steps. It doesn't necessarily have to mean an alliance, but something close to it.
Okay. Bharat, yeah,
again,
I'm sorry, I'm going to cut it short because I've got limited time. So, Bharat, Karnad, as far as what to expect from the Quad, what do you think we can expect, and do you believe that we shouldn't set the bar too high at the moment, at least?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as I said, it'll be a practical sort of an arrangement, and not something where all ideologies converge and shared interest, this, that, and the other. There's a minimum sharing of interests, and it's basically a sort of focusing on the threat, common threat, and that's all. I don't see much beyond that. Of course, each country will deal with the situation they face in its own way. To the extent that China can, I suppose, China will try to have, cut separate deals to undermine and undercut any kind of a partnership as it sees emerging, as it did the ASEAN. It in a very big way, co-opted Cambodia and Laos, for instance, which were the very first countries that pretty much, torpedoed the ASEAN unity. So once they had Cambodia and Laos on their side, that ASEAN solidarity was done for. That was finished. And their state bought, as it were, because they are very poor countries and they can't resist the temptations that the China puts before them in terms of aid, assistance, help, etc., and financial subsidies and grants. So that's the tactic I think they'll use elsewhere. Not very successfully, I don't think, because other than these very small, very weak, very poor countries, the rest of the countries in the ASEAN and on the littoral are fairly prosperous, with quite formidable militaries in their own way, whether it's any of the countries you can think of, even a small country like Singapore, for instance. It doesn't have much by way of strategic anything, but I don't think the Chinese will be able to take liberties near shore of a Singapore, even a Singapore, which is just a city-state, nothing else, quite inconsequential. And therefore, that is the stuff that has to be always mindful of.
Right.
And I think that's where each of the country doing what it can to the maximum to contain and hedge in China's options is what we'll end up doing.
Sure. Dhruva, Jaishankar, Donald Trump has time and again said that India should play a bigger role in the India-Pacific or Indo-Pacific. Should we be concerned by those statements of Donald Trump, and should we safeguard our own interests first before we try something out with Donald Trump?
I think we have to turn our long-standing thinking on its head a little bit. For the longest time, India was concerned about being dragged into if not an alliance, some sort of alliance-like relationship with the United States, being an instrument of U.S. advancement. I think, particularly over the Obama years, the rise of power of India, the relative decline of power of the United States in Asia, things have turned on its head a little bit. Now, in fact, it is actually India that is leading the charge. So if you look at India's position on Belt and Road, which India initially was an early adopter of, and now the United States and Japan and others have come on board. On the Indian Ocean, it was the securing of the Indian Ocean in particular, on supporting on blocking Chinese advancement in a third country in Bhutan.
Bhutan, yes.
I mean, in many areas, you see actually India leading the charge, and the U.S. is now following. And so, in fact, it is the US that is a very late adopter to the concept of the Indo-Pacific, the idea that the Pacific and the Indian Oceans form a single strategic space. Japan, in their own ways, Japan, Australia, and then India all adopted that much sooner. So I don't think we should be concerned. I think we should be concerned about a more recessed United States. And I think every indication by the Trump administration, particularly his advisors and his military advisors, indicates quite the opposite. And I think that should be encouraging from India's point of view.
All right, we'll have to leave it at that then, because we're completely out of time on the program today. Sushant, Sareen, Bharat, Karnad, Dhruva, Jaishankar, Uday, Bhaskar. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's all the time we have today. See you again next time.